what we said yesterday. We were talking about all of the Torah that we study, and every time we learn, we want to know the difference between a law and a custom. Is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? We talked about that yesterday at greater length, and we're going to rush through it today. And we said the many details of the Seder are very regimented. And what we discussed was that there are, how many parts to the Seder? 14, 15 parts of the Seder. We have the 4 questions. We have the 3 matzahs. We have the 4 cups of wine. There's so much. And the thing is, pedantic as it might be, they are far from trivial. And we explored the basis behind some of the numbers. That's what we did yesterday. And we asked, is it rabbinical or is it biblical? And we discovered that the 3 matzahs we know are biblical. As you could see, it is something we are commanded in the Torah. And then we asked about the 4 cups of wine. 3 matzahs. We said the matzahs itself is biblical, but the number, we discussed why you need 2 whole matzahs and 1 for the lechem oni, on which we are reciting the Haggadah on the pauper's bread, so to say. So that leaves us with the 3rd matzah that's going to be broken. And we gave you the sources, as you can see on the screen. Now, the 4 cups of wine we discussed, we know, is rabbinic. Although it is based on the 4 expressions of redemption that I mentioned in the Torah, which I'll put back on the previous screen, as you can see right there. I'll extract you, I'll save you, I will redeem you, and I will take you. But they are still rabbinic, based on biblical verses. The question we asked us, why is the wine the one that's 4 and the matzahs 3? If actually the matzahs are biblical, why shouldn't we emphasize and highlight the matzah rather? Maybe the matzahs should be 4 and the wine should be 3. I'm just recapping. I'll take questions. No, in terms of actual observance, we observe both with the same stringency and importance. But in terms of source, so we're asking this question, why is it not 4 matzahs, which if it's biblical, why didn't the rabbi say 4 matzahs and 3 cups of wine? And then we went on to say that actually in Judaism, every letter is every letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a number. And we went on to discuss how there's numerical values. And we said that there's a story in the Gemara where they said the Aleph Bet stands for, who remembers, stands for Aleph Bina, which means to learn wisdom. And we said the Gimel Dalet stands for Gomel Dalim, which means to give to the destitute, right? To bestow kindness. So the question we asked was, why is the foot of the Gimel stretched towards the Dalet? And we explained that even the shape of the letters has to do with the importance of these letters. And it's both the name of the letters, Gimel Dalet, Gomel Dalim, bestowing kindness, giving to the Dalim, which is the destitute. You look at the shape of the letter, but it's not only the shape of the letter, it's also the value of the letter. So as you look here, every letter of the Torah has every letter in Hebrew has a numerical value. So Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. Aleph is 1, Bez is 2, Gimel is 3, Dalet is 4. Only have to talk about those, because only those are relevant to our discussion. And we said that the Gimel, which is 3, is about giving, and the Dalet, which is 4, is about receiving. And then I shared with you a Hasidic discourse, as you can see it on the screen. With this discourse analyzes the significance of the letters. What we explained was 3 is a numerology for giving, whereas 4 is receiving. And it was explained as follows. What are the 3 steps of giving? When you have an idea, that idea is then contracted in your mind, and then you teach it, you speak it. The same thing is, you have some money, it's yours. Now you are willing to take it out, and then you give it. But the 4th level is the recipient, the person who is receiving it. And then we said, well, what does this have to do with the song of who knows one? 3 are the mothers, 4 are the fathers. And if you recall yesterday, we talked about how 3 is a number that is related, the giving is a male, biologically to create a child. A male is the one who gives the male is the one who contributes the seed, and it is the female, the mother, who receives it. So with this, we can understand now why it's 3 mothers and 4 fathers, because 3 is a number related to giving, whereas 4 is the number of receiving. So we're saying is that when we look at the numbers at the Seder, we dived into this whole concept of numerology, and we see how the shapes and the value of the letters, it has deep meaning to itself as well. Yeah. Yes, 4 mothers, 3 fathers, correct. If I said the opposite, 3 fathers, 4 mothers. Okay, my apologies. I'm glad you're paying attention. I'm glad you're all paying attention. One at a time, please. I can't hear. 3 fathers, 4 mothers. 3 is about giving, 4 is about receiving. Yeah. What are you asking, Malcolm? Well, practically speaking, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov never intended to have to marry both Rachel and Leah. He was in love with Rachel, but we know this. We know the story. Excuse me, how he winds up marrying Leah as well. But that's the actual facts of the story. Now we're talking not about the details of the story, but rather about the significance and the symbolism of it. Yes.
I don't know if you want to hear it or if it's the right place, but there is a mystical / biological interpretation. If we follow 4 mothers as well.
If it's relevant, go ahead. If it's a digression, then don't.
It's relevant to.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
When a baby is created,
Yeah.
the mother contributes the greater portion of the primary, the sperm combines with the egg.
Yeah.
Most of the combination comes from the mother. That's why it's 4. And only half of the genetics comes from the father. That's why.
Well, that's an interesting and fascinating point, that the mother definitely is giving a lot more. So even though she might be considered the recipient, the woman is certainly giving 9 months of gestation and doing the bulk of the work. The man's got just a moment, and then.
But I'm talking in terms of cell.
And cells are well, interesting.
99% of the cell come from the mother, 1% from the father.
So how is it that kids oftentimes look exactly?
Genetics, not chemistry.
Right. All right. That's a very interesting point. That was just the recap of yesterday. Now let's go to where we left off. Yesterday, we left off talking about how the story of the Exodus is really an extraordinary, dramatic story of the birth of our people. And we talk about their miraculous emancipation from slavery in Egypt and their self-determination. Like we said before, that the Hayom Yom today, in fact, discusses this idea that we said Nasa v'Nishma, how we became the Jewish people at Mount Sinai and everything else. So Hasidus tells us there's another interesting spin, very intriguing idea, and that is, in fact, we touched on it yesterday, how the Jewish people were literally at the 49th level of impurity, 49 gates of impurity. They were literally right there. And yet, Kabbalah tells us that at the time of the liberation, although they were sitting at this low level, they were stooped into Egyptian depravity. As slaves, they were immersed in Egyptian society. They were permeated and influenced by everything Egyptian. They were so deeply submerged that our sages tell us, were they in the deprivations of the Egyptian culture and lifestyle for one more moment, they probably would never have been rescued, because they were so entrenched. They would have reached the 50th gate, at the very depths of impurity, and God literally had to schlep them out. This ultimate impurity is the point of no return. And had they sunk that far, they would have never been able to emerge. And therefore, God acted to extract the people with such haste, to swoop in from above, to schlep them out, ready or not. And more than it was a story of self-determination, the act of Exodus was ultimately God's story. If he hadn't taken us out, we would still be there, right? They would have been lost. Clive, relax. Let people be, please. Yeah. So this is all, but God had to rescue them. God had to save them, right? And it's this. Well, I want to say this. Just like God took them out and they couldn't do it on their own. Even if we have a limited capacity, we try, we make the effort. Like you said, they cried for help and Hashem listened. Whatever challenges you might be facing in your life, the same thing is true. You cry out to Hashem and Hashem will help. There's no doubt. And I think it's this aspect of the Exodus story, this top-down nature of the Jews' liberation that the matzah represents. The matzah is deliberately kept simple. This is symbolized by the matzah. It's about the spiritual poverty, right? The matzah is unseasoned. It's without flavor. It's poor man's bread, because this reflects a spiritual poverty of sorts. We're not dealing with a people whose initial commitment to God was born of a rich and interreligious experience like the wine that's filled with flavor and appreciation. That came later. That's why the Jews say, Na'aseh, we will do. And only afterwards comes Venishma, we'll understand, we'll appreciate, we'll assimilate, we'll get into the details. For someone without a sense for the spiritual, without any appreciation for Torah and mitzvahs, a meaningful engagement with Judaism can only begin by first breaking free of a purely materialistic life outlook. Matzah is often said to represent a leap of pure faith. And as far as leaps go, the Exodus was less a graceful swan dive than it was getting pushed into the pool. Yes. And that's why, what do we say in the Haggadah? Matzah zu she'anarich l'mashuma. This matzah that we eat, al shuma, for what reason? And we say, because the dough of our fathers did not have time to become leavened, Hashem rushed them out of Egypt. It was only after the actual Exodus and the splitting of the sea, once the Jews had gotten out of there, that their own ground-up spiritual development could commence, could begin to develop. The next 49 days, from Exodus to Mount Sinai, there was a whole program of progressive internal growth, which is what we do today as well. We don't just count the days of Sphira. We make every day count, right? We, just like they earned the redemption. God took them out of Egypt. Now they worked on a process of taking Egypt out of themselves. We do that too. During the counting of the Omer, every day we count another Sphira with it. We count the days and we count the weeks. We realize that both are important. The days are the individuals. The weeks are the collective, the community. Both an important idea. As we go now into, what's the Aries? No, we're in Taurus still. Aries. Taurus? Right. Now we're not in Taurus yet. Pesach starts in Aries, and we're going to move into Taurus. Because the counting, pardon? Yes, it is part of Judaism. It has Hebrew terminology. But for sure, Tleh is Aries. Shor, the bull, is Taurus. And then I think it's called Te'umim, Gemini. If you look at the period of Pesach, the Exodus happens during the period of Aries, when we were like sheep, herd, Exodus, all coming out together. But then from there, is the bull. The bull is about individualism. A bull is very self-determined. So it's about counting the days, working on ourselves. But you can only work on yourself, realizing we're part of a greater community. And well, one second, one at a time. Only then, once both ideas are internalized, comes Gemini, which is when we receive the Torah.
What Spora is thinking about is the instruction that we may not use those signs to forecast the future.
Yeah, it says a mazal, so we're not controlled by it, but there is a mazal, it exists. We're not controlled by the mazel, but it certainly exists. And that's why we talk about the 49 gates of impurity. Without getting into the details of it, the idea is that we work on refining ourselves. That's the point. So what did the Jews do? After they left Egypt, they worked on refining themselves. By the 50th day, they were already eagerly waiting to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. They were finally capable of appreciating the life, the legacy that the Torah would represent. And so the Exodus process was only complete once they got to that stage, once they were already refined. And that's exactly what we do during the Omer. There's 3 stages. We're starting off with Aries, where we realize we're part of a greater whole. We then move into Taurus, where we work on ourselves. So once we realize we're part of a greater collective, then we realize what each individual can contribute. And then we realize we have to synthesize, we have to synchronize, we have to come together and bring both together, which is where we could receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. So it's about taking these ideas, putting them together, and that's the final stage of the redemption. It's the Jewish people's capacity to engage with a full-throated Judaism. And that's characterized by the wine. How is it characterized by the wine? What is the wine? The wine is flavor. 50 days later, after they worked on themselves, there was spiritual growth, there was redemption, and they said, we'll accept the Torah Nasa v'nishma regardless of what we understand. Nasa came first, but then came v'nishma. What's v'nishma? Unlike the matzah, which is simple, right? Matzah is just flour and water. That's all. But the wine's fermentation process is like the 50 days between Pesach and Shavuos, where we work on ourselves. It's like the fermentation. You ever go to a wine tasting and they start telling you about the flavor, the volume, and the all the different aromas and the chveisnish. I'm not a wine connoisseur, but I got 2 cousins who own wine, 2 big wine brands. So they could hack a chinik to you and tell you all the great jargon. But the point I'm making is wine is something we savor, we relish the taste. Right? It's not just knocked back. The wine, you really need to have an appreciation for it. And that's the point. If you have enough to drink, what does the wine do to you? Maybe not drunk, but maybe it opens you up a little bit more. You start to sing, maybe you dance, you get merry. That's what we want to get to. Wine represents that fuller relationship with God. The geschmack of Torah, when keeping the mitzvahs, is a delightful thing, rather than being a burden, no more than a grim commitment to Judaism that I just do it by rote. But it's not just I'm doing it out of guilt, but rather it's a pleasure, just like wine is a pleasure, a delight to drink. We want our Yiddishkeit to be a pleasure, but that didn't happen overnight. That took time. So you're sanctifying, you're uplifting, you're taking something that otherwise could be used to just get drunk, and you're using it for a sanctified purpose. And Yom Tov, yeah. Well, we're using it for Kedusha here. Okay, yeah. Yep. Well, he was guiding them, he was counseling them. No doubt that was part of the process, sure. So let's summarize. Yeah. That's exactly it. It takes time for it to ferment and mature. And the same thing is, although the Exodus took place quickly, they had no time for the bread to rise. God had to schlep them out of Egypt so quick. That's the matzah. It wasn't about flavor. It was about doing it. The wine is about appreciating the flavor, growing, fermenting. So now, let's just recap. We've identified 2 distinct stages of the Exodus process, right? In the matzah stage that we were talking about, right? Let's go back for a second. Matzah, right here. The matzah stage, where is it? Yeah, I don't know where I put it. Okay, but this is about the matzah. In the matzah stage, the Jewish people were not enjoying their Judaism per se. right? It was a tasteless experience. Matzah doesn't have taste it. They were still sunken in the moral depravities of Egypt. Their low spiritual state meant that they had to be rushed out. They didn't, because they couldn't do it on their own. God had to do it for them, right? And God couldn't risk letting them stay there. Who knows what could have happened? So that's one level. That's the level of matzah where it's tasteless. But let's go to the level of wine. In the wine stage, they began to feel and taste the beauty, the richness of their Judaism, becoming a people that no longer needed to be whisked away from the evil. So if you think about it that way, you think about a student being made to attend a class that they have no interest in. What happens? You're forced to sit and listen to a lecture to some boring guy drone on, and you're taking notes now. You have no interest in it, right? One guy, one time in the middle of the shiur, the pot plant fell. Rabbi says, I put people to sleep. Didn't realize I also put pot plants to sleep too. So, but that's only one part. You're there, you have no interest maybe, but when you actually have an interest, and that could happen as we get older and more mature, and all of a sudden there's a personal interest in our learning, in our studies, then it becomes something like the wine, where all of a sudden you have a personal gain in the matter, right? You say, I'm not forced to be in this class. Nobody's forcing you to be here. Hopefully you're learning something while you're here. And that's when you start to have the wine element, that you start to appreciate the information, and maybe you even like to learn more on your own. Then you're fully absorbing and receiving the information. It's coming from bottom up, not from top down. Top down is God swooping us out of Egypt. That's the matzah stage. There's no appreciation. You're just being pulled out. There you go. Yep. So we're all maturing with our age. So the first stage was God bestowing freedom. That's called Isarusa de Leila. God does it. But the second stage is us receiving the freedom, pulling ourselves out of Egypt. Matzah represents God's part in the Exodus story. Now you understand why the matzah's the biblical part. That's God giving, number 3. And wine is receiving. It's where you appreciate. That's number 4. So now we could go back to the numbers. How many matzahs do we need on the Seder tonight? That's it. Why? It represents the 3 stages of giving. When the Jewish people had no emotional or spiritual role in the liberation, it was just granted from heaven. God did all the work. How many cups of wine? What's the significance of the 4 cups of wine? Well, 4 are the 4 stages of receiving. When the Jewish people became active recipients and participants of their heritage and their freedom. And that's what we are aspiring towards. And all of this we could see within the language of the Torah. The 4 cups recall, what do they recall? The 4 expressions of redemption that were used to describe the liberation from Egypt. And on the surface of it, all 4 phases may seem to be depicting the same set of events. 4 expressions, maybe they're just adjectives. But the truth is, the Torah is not redundant. No words in the Torah are superfluous and repetitive, right? I like to add an extra adjective. I think it makes me sound sophisticated. So I can take some very simple lessons, and as long as I add in some extra words, you guys are convinced, this guy got an education. Not so much. It's just me throwing some words around. But I don't think God needs to do that. So why does God use 4 specific words of redemption? Let's go back to that verse in the Torah. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, "Lechein amar lebnei Yisrael," therefore say to the children of Israel, "Ani Hashem, I am the Lord your God. V'hoitzeisi, I will extract you mitachas sivlas Mitzrayim, from the burdens of the slavery in Egypt," right? V'hitzalti, God says, I will save you from a avodah, from their labor. V'go'alti, I will redeem you Biyad chazak with an outstretched arm, uvishvatim gedolim, and with great judgments. And then v'lakachti, I will take you to me as a people. So let's understand this. 4 expressions. V'hitzesi, I will extract you. V'hitzalti, I will rescue, I will save you. V'ga'alti, I will redeem you. V'lakachti, I'll take you to me as a people. This is when God informed Moses, long before. So let's just understand for a moment. Notice the change in the language, in the content. The first 3 expressions are describing an action by an active subject, God, on a passive subject, us. Yes? And it's depicting, if you think about it, all these 4 expressions, the Jews' physical departure from Egypt as performed by God. God is giving, giving, giving. I will take you, though the 4th expression where God says, I will take you to me as a people, does not describe a physical movement, but rather it refers to a spiritual transition to the change in identity that occurred at Mount Sinai when the Jewish people became God's chosen people. So while the Jewish people are still the object of the verb, there's far greater degree of involvement implied here than in the earlier phrases. The verse seems to say the Jewish people must contribute something of their own here. It speaks of the Jewish people becoming God's people. I will take you to me as a people, something that could only be initiated by us accepting God as our king. So based on this understanding, the matzah may also be understood to recall the Torah's phrases of freedom. The first 3 is one of the great commentators known as the Mordechai. He suggests that the first 3 expressions are the matzah. It was all done by God. You think about it, matzah is intended to symbolize the Exodus. But there's an important caveat here. Only the first 3 phrases correspond to the top-down liberation that's represented by the matzah. And therefore was the drinking of wine representing the completed liberation process of the Jewish people and their embrace of the freedom that was explicitly instituted to represent all 4 levels. And what's the 4th expression? Where we
Thank you so much.
Pardon, Leonie?
Well, it's
Leonie? Okay, so let me conclude with one last point and then get into an introduction to tomorrow's shiur. The matzah is biblically mandated, right? It is a biblical obligation. It is a mitzvah. It's a commandment. But the wine is rabbinic, right? The fact that this is the case, obviously we gave this idea, but there's a verse from King Solomon. Shlomo HaMelech says, Shema b'ni musar avicha. You've heard of this? Mordechai Medever, it's a beautiful song. Shema b'ni musar avicha. I'm putting everyone to sleep with the song. All right, back to studies. What does that mean? Listen, my son, my child, musar avicha, to the discipline of your father. But it doesn't end there. What does he say? The al titoish toidas imecha. Do not forsake the instruction of your mother. What does this mean? Now, at first blush, doesn't it seem again repetitive, a little bit redundant? What's the difference between the discipline of your father and the instruction of your mother? Why does the verse say that listen to the discipline of your father and do not forsake the instruction of your mother? Father stricter, more disciplinary. So, yeah.
The father is instructed to teach himself.
Okay, but we still have the instruction of your mother here.
Yes, but the actual teaching comes from 30 of the 18.
So we're saying the discipline of your father, listen to the discipline of your father. do not forsake the instruction of your mother. Now let's understand the symbolism that we said here, that you gave your input before about the 3 and the 4, or the mother and the father, I think is very relevant here. And just like we use the example of biology, in which the father assumes the role of the giver, right? And the mother is the recipient. Let's understand, what does that mean? The fact that the mother is more about active participation. The mother plays a much greater role. She is the one who carries through and gives more of the genetic input. As long as the receiver is passive, we're still in the father mode. We're still like in the Exodus, where God was doing everything, okay? And sometimes we fathers can be very instructive, but it's not appreciated necessarily by the child, unlike the loving way of the mother. Let's just think as an example of a military officer, okay? He gives a set of rules to his men, to his soldiers. And oftentimes the officer will provide little reasoning for the command. I said so, right? Oftentimes fathers do that. You give the soldiers no understanding of how their action is going to help the cause. Just do what I say. Why do I have to do 100 jumping jacks or run around the field 25 times? That's what I said, right? Do it unquestioningly. Now, in such cases, although the subordinate received the instruction and might dutifully carry it out, it's as though they're not part of the picture. The mefaked, the general said, do it, you got to do what you're told. That's it. As long as he remains intellectually and emotionally uninvested, he will show no initiative of his own. He'll just do what he has to do. But the success and failure of the mission belong almost exclusively to the giver, to the father, to the instructor, to the general. The mother mode. What's the mother mode? Let's talk about instruction of the mother. What's the idea of the mother? Well, it sounds like the mother is the consumer, the recipient, but let's talk about that. Yes. When we look at the mode of the mother, that would be when the employer explains why she wants the particular task done, right? Not just saying do it, but why? What's the reason, the meaning, the purpose, what you'll achieve, the benefits of it. And she delegates responsibility along with the orders, so that the employee is motivated, is inspired, they take initiative. So what does this have to do with the Torah? The Torah essentially is God's guidance to us, right? And it contains both of these modes of instruction. But by Torah, I'm not just talking about the 5 books of the Chumash, but the entire scheme of divinely inspired instructions, which includes the rabbinical ones. And that's the mother. When King Solomon spoke about the discipline of your father and the instruction of your mother, he's talking about both of these modes. And in Tanya, it talks about this, and it tells us that we have to understand that there's 2 elements to Judaism. There is Musar Avicha, the discipline of your father, and that refers to the divine code as it's delivered directly from on high. Yes, the written Torah has to be studied in order for it to be understood. And yes, it's God's instruction, and we do it as God says. But ultimately, we collectively as the Jewish people, we the people, we don't have a role in the formulation, in the development of the laws of the Torah. It's God's instruction. It's biblical. Biblical law was given to us in an eternal, immutable form, simply for us to hear and to obey. Or to paraphrase that memorable declaration we said at Mount Sinai, Na'aseh v'nishma, to do first and then to understand. Now, what's Torah Simecha? What's the instruction of your mother? That represents an entirely different mode of divine connection. That's rabbinic law. Here, the Jewish people's observance is no longer mute. passive, an unleavened, unflavored experience. As the Torah enters the world of the receiver, once it has been absorbed and understood, like a mother who is now taking that little bit of sperm and developing it, for lack of a better example. As the Torah enters our world and we develop and appreciate and the ideas start to resonate, then what happens in every generation? We interpret the law that's transmitted to us. We come to appreciate it. To borrow a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, rabbinic law is the product of the people, tailored for the people, and accepted by the people. As active participants in the process, we are able to fully engage with and appreciate this experience then, like wine, which you savor the flavor. So remember, while the matzah is biblical, it represents that tap-down nature of God's command to us. We do it because God said so. But like matzah, there's no flavor at that stage. There's no taste. We do because God said so, whether we appreciate it or not. But once it becomes rabbinic means the laws that were introduced, that were formulated, that were developed by the sages. Now we're in a whole new stage full of flavor and delight to drink and to appreciate. And that's the significance of the wine. So although the matzah is flavorless, the wine is flavorful. And so the next time we encounter a rabbinic mitzvah, whatever it might be, or even a custom, and there's many wonderful, beautiful customs, it's worth bearing this lesson in mind. As uncomfortable as some modern day people may be with the idea of divine authority in general, it is especially tempting to dismiss the entire this dimension of Judaism, right? We might say the 5 books of Moses are the direct product of divine revelation. But all these rabbinic safeguards and all the laws, kosher and family, who made this stuff up? What relevance can man-made fabrications have to a truly religious, spiritual experience? Like the man I met who said to me, only that which is in the Torah I do. But nothing can be further from the truth. Rabbinic law is your mother's instruction. That's what it is. It's the product of an organic and deeply felt awareness, such as that which a mother gently and patiently includes and inculcates within her child. And in some ways, these rabbinic man-made laws, these aspects of Jewish law that our sages, human beings, gave us, are just as important, maybe even more important. I shouldn't say that, but I hope you know what I mean. Than the commandments that God gave us. Not in any way, I don't mean a superiority to man, but it gives us a chance to own Judaism for ourselves. That's the point I'm making. To foster, to demonstrate our profound commitment to the beautiful ancient heritage that we have received. So it's about taking God's commandments and now beautifying them. You can't make something more beautiful than God made it. But what you can do is appreciate. That's the wine. It's appreciating the taste and the flavor. And with every one of those 4 cups of wine that we're going to drink on the Seder night next week, we declare with a whole heart and with a full voice and the full flavor that it's not just a duty, flavorless duty like matzah, but it's a pleasure. It's divine and fun to be a Jew. And that's the point. So I think it's a profound idea. And I hope you all came to appreciate these concepts. And while we need to conclude shortly, I want to introduce tomorrow's shiur. Because tomorrow we're going to take a look at something that I believe Miriam will spend more time on Thursday, please God, maybe from another angle, is the Haftorah that we read on Pesach on Shabbos, Chol HaMoed, next Shabbos. And that is a very fascinating story. As you could see on the screen, it relates an incredible vision of redemption. People rising from their graves and a lamb and a wolf relaxing together. How do you like that? What's that? Wolf and Lamb is the name of a restaurant.
There's a lion on
Because that's what the artist put there. But the Haftarah talks, we also talk about lions. In the Haftarah, what I'll do is I'll put the actual words up on the screen. So actually we could get the actual words because I think we need to know what it talks about. I want to just introduce the class. Tomorrow I will go into it. And on Thursday, Miriam will give you an elaboration and deeper insights into it. So, like I said, Shabbos Chalamayid, read this Haftarah, the vision of Ezekiel, the prophet, Yecheskel, of the dry bones, which he brought back to life. Now, we're going to look at the source, the text. It's discussed by the sages, mentioned in the Talmud. What were these dry bones? In the Talmud, there are differing opinions as to whether they actually happened or if it's just a metaphor. So we'll talk about that. And the sages are conflicted about these. Who were these deceased people? Whose bones were they if it's a true story and not a metaphor, right? One opinion is that they were from the tribe of Ephraim who left Egypt early on their own, and they fell in the battle with the Philistines. They left before the time. Imagine people who tried to escape Auschwitz and were, caught by the Nazis, God forbid. They wound up they didn't survive. Another opinion is that there were young Jews who were exiled to Babylon and they were killed by Nebuchadnezzar hundreds of years later. So different opinions as to who they were. And God tells the prophet Ezekiel that the message of this prophecy is encouragement for the Jewish people not to lose hope in exile. And so this Haftarah that we're going to read next Shabbos, why do we read it then? What are we reading? What's the significance, the connection, the relevance of Shabbos Chalamayid to the resurrection of the dead? Well, we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, but obviously the basic connection is the redemption of the past to the redemption of the future. And so there was a queen, Cleopatra, and she believed in the resurrection. And she asked the sages, how exactly could it take place? We're going to look at this from the sources in the Gemara, please God, tomorrow on the screen. And the prophet Isaiah described this future messianic redemption with a utopian vision. He says the wool will live with the lamb and the leopard will lie down with the goat. And we'll look at the different sources in the book of Isaiah. And Maimonides' commentary, and he says that these depictions are not literal. It's a metaphor for how people will live in peace and harmony with one another. But nature itself, according to Maimonides, will not change. And when you go to Kruger Park, you'll still see lions chasing and going for the kill. Nachmanides, on the other hand, says that nature itself will change in the Messianic era. And this prophecy will come to pass in the literal sense. However, regarding the resurrection, Maimonides counts belief in the future, part of the 13 principles of Jewish faith. He says that this element of it is metaphoric, the wolf lying with the lamb. It just symbolizes the idea that we will all live in peace. Imagine, forget about the world living at peace. Imagine all of us here living in peace. Yesterday, I visited Sandringham Gardens. Oh, one guy was chewing my ear off about how annoying the people he sits at dinner with are. So why don't you sit at another table then? So they're even worse. What can we do? Thank God we don't have these fights here, right? But my friends, like I said in Purim, about the mitzvahs of Purim, it has to do with loving your neighbor as yourself. If all neighbors got along, the whole world would live in peace. So Maimonides says it's a metaphor about that. Now, I'm just giving you a summary, and please God, tomorrow we'll go into details. The Rebbe asks how both quotes from Maimonides, where on the one hand, Maimonides says, this picture is just a fantastical metaphor. Again, unlike Nachmanides, who felt that this is going to be something literally wolves lying with lambs. Yet Maimonides tells us we believe in the resurrection of the dead. It's a fundamental principle of a tenet of Judaism. So why is it that Maimonides believes that the dead could come to life and thinks that this is metaphorical? Why is one any less possible than the other. One says there'll be no change in the natural order. Maimonides is saying the wolf won't live with the lamb. The world will be peaceful. Nature won't change. Yet Maimonides tells us that a basic tenet of Judaism is that my parents who passed away too long ago, their life was cut too short, will come back to life. And my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and yours too. So why is one acceptable and the other not to Maimonides? In short, I'm not going to give away the whole class now. You have to come back tomorrow. I'm going to give you just a flavor, a taste. The Rebbe explains that there's two phases of the Messianic era. At first, the world will remain unchanged, but later the natural order will actually be suspended or superseded with these changes. And so, based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, that a soul comes into this world to bring life, to be there for another. Dry bones could be literal resurrection, and please God, that happens when Mashiach comes. But it can also be a metaphor. We'll talk more about that metaphor tomorrow. But how many times have we met people who they might be breathing and living, but for all intents and purposes, they seem dead? Remember the story I told you about that sukkah of the guy who could never crack a smile? Remember that story? Told it to you sukkah's time. Well, the story of that guy who couldn't smile is just an example of somebody who perhaps was living, but was like dead. What somebody described to me last night as a dead man walking. And I asked, why is he a dead man walking? He's overworked. He's killing himself. Someone was referring to me about a particular person. Well, my friends, while there are people spiritually devoid of mitzvahs, you could bring them back to life. You could bring them back to life. I want to tell you a story here without disclosing any details because it might, So yesterday I get an email of somebody from Israel wants to book for our Pesach retreat. We got like 4 rooms left, and I'm eager to make sure it's sold out because we lose and not selling it. Anyways, I call this number up and the lady says, she's coming from Israel. Oh, it's a little expensive. She doesn't know if she can afford it. We start talking a little bit. And I asked her, did you ever hear of this hotel? Have you ever been there? Again, not giving away much information. She winds up telling me, yes, she was there many years ago. And then she tells me her surname. And I go, oh, is your mother so-and-so? She says, how do you know my mother? So, well, I run the Chabad Seniors Club. She says, oh my goodness. You're the one. Anyways, not to toot my own horn. I don't mean to do that. But she said to me, her mother was a woman who raised her children as, to quote her, she said atheists or agnostics at best. She said she didn't believe. She was always anti-religious, blah, blah, blah. Today, this woman has a few frum children living around the world, including locally. And she comes to my classes once a week at one of the retirement facilities that I visit. And the daughter was telling me, you revived how I revived her mother. So to me, that's fascinating. That each one of us could play our role in some way or another. Again, I'm talking metaphorically here as Maimonides does, but this could be literally too. So there's the metaphoric aspect that we could talk about tomorrow, how you could take dry bones, people who maybe we're apathetic, we're not involved in the Yiddishkeit. You could bring them back to life, my friends. Some people say there's no point in teaching Torah to Jews who are so far away. They're like dry bones, no connection. Yet the Rebbe would say, learn from the story of Ezekiel. Whether you want to understand it literally like Nachmanides, or you only understand it metaphorically like Maimonides. Either way, there's value to learn from this. And that is, we can help bring people back to life one way or another. And the story teaches us not to suffice with having just one person. In the story, Ezekiel revives dry bones, many people. God's command to Ezekiel, to the prophet, was to tell the dry bones God's command, to bring them back to life. think about how we could bring others back to life. And so, my friends, I'm looking forward to look at this tomorrow. I only see it as an introduction to Thursday's shir. And I think you'll have a lot to learn from this and to apply to how we could bring life to ourselves and to others. I'm looking forward to the shir with you, please God, tomorrow. Any questions before we go to lunch? Yeah. 4 glasses, 3 matzahs.
3 months, minimum.
Yeah, you're gonna break the middle one. That's gonna be the one that's lechem oni, the impoverished bread.
Okay, what about bread?
You can use grape juice if you can't have wine, sure. Wine is preferable, but if it's gonna intoxicate you, you can mix it. You can mix wine and grape juice together. That also works. Because we shouldn't be driving after. Seder's at home. By the way, I had 2 people some time ago on a Friday night. It was during COVID. I remember it was during when we had to be home by 10 p.m. Remember when I'm locked down, probably just over a year ago, 2 years ago maybe, when it was like already past the crazy lockdown, but we were still wearing masks. And I had 2 people who left my house. And in the morning, they came to shul and told me they were both stopped. At my table, I don't imbibe people, but there's whiskey to drink and there's wine to drink. And boy, these 2 guys almost got into serious trouble. So I learned I don't impose it on anybody. In fact, I tell them, you want to drink whiskey at my Shabbos table? Then you can't drive home. You could sleep in my house and keep Shabbos. All right, ladies and gents, please God, tomorrow we'll continue and we will discuss the dry bones and lessons we can learn from them with texts inside. It will be interesting. I'm looking forward. Thank you all.